6 weeks before my wedding, our florist sent me an invoice for peonies and ranunculus I never ordered, for a ceremony in a city I had never once heard my fiancé mention, addressed to a bride whose name was not mine. The subject line read, Ashcombe Reyes Wedding, Final Floral Confirmation. My last name was going to be Ashcombe in 6 weeks. So, apparently, was someone else's 2 weeks before that. I didn't call the florist to correct the mistake. I didn't call Julian either. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open until 3 in the morning, and by the time the sun came up, I understood that the wedding I was planning wasn't a mistake anyone else had made. It was one I was about to make myself, unless I did something about it first. My name is Sienna Okafor. I'm 31. And this is the story of how a florist's copy-paste error was the only reason I found out I was about to become the second bride in a story where I had always believed I was the only one. Julian Ashcombe and I met 4 years ago at an industry dinner. I ran brand partnerships for a hospitality marketing firm, and he was the youngest of 3 siblings running Ashcombe Collection, a small but well-regarded chain of boutique hotels his grandfather had started decades earlier. He had the kind of easy, unhurried charm that made rooms rearrange themselves around him without him seeming to notice or want it. He asked me thoughtful questions and actually waited for the answers, which I'd learned by then was rarer in men like him than it should have been. We started seeing each other 3 months later, once a project we'd both worked on wrapped, and there was no longer a professional reason to pretend the tension between us was about the deck. For 4 years, I watched him build his piece of that family company into something distinctly his own, a boutique property in Savannah he'd renovated from nearly nothing. A second one taking shape in Charleston that was supposed to open the same season as our wedding. He traveled constantly, which I understood, because hospitality is a business built on being physically present in the places you're trying to make beautiful. I never once questioned the travel. I helped him pick fabric swatches over video calls at midnight. I flew down to Savannah for property walkthroughs and gave him notes on lighting he actually used. When he proposed, 18 months ago, on the rooftop of the Savannah property before it had even opened to guests, I said yes standing in a half-finished bar area surrounded by exposed brick and plastic sheeting. And it felt like the most honest place a proposal could have happened, inside something he was still actively building, the way I felt like I'd been inside something we were still actively building, together, for years. We set our wedding date for the second week of October, in Charleston, at the newer property, timed deliberately to double as its soft launch event, a wedding and a grand opening rolled into one, which Julian had framed as romantic when he pitched it to me, and which I had genuinely believed was romantic because I had no reason yet to believe otherwise. The florist email arrived on a Tuesday morning in early September, 6 weeks out from our date. Our own florist, a small studio called Marigold and Salt that Julian had used for both Ashcombe property soft openings and that I'd hired for our wedding specifically because he trusted them, sent what was clearly meant to be an internal team email. A final confirmation spreadsheet, CC'd to what I assumed was every current client on their books, including me by accident. Most of the rows were irrelevant. One row was not. Ashcombe Reyes Wedding, September 28th, Bethesda Manor, Savannah, Georgia, bride, Bianca Reyes, groom, Julian Ashcombe, confirm peony/ranunculus order per attached. I read it 4 times before I let myself believe I wasn't misreading it. Same groom. Same last name pairing, my own future last name paired with a different first name. A wedding date 18 days before mine, at a venue I recognized immediately, because it was 2 blocks from the Savannah property Julian had personally renovated and where he still stayed, by his own account, roughly 1 week out of every month, checking on operations. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't forward it to him with a confused question mark, the way some earlier version of myself might have. A version who still believed a clerical error was the most likely explanation for a groom's name appearing twice on 2 different wedding contracts 18 days apart. Instead, I closed my laptop, made myself dinner, sat across from Julian that night while he talked about seating charts for our own wedding, and said nothing at all, while something in my chest went very quiet and very still, the way a room goes still right before someone realizes they're not alone in it. That first night, once he'd fallen asleep, I opened my laptop again and started looking, the way you look for something you're both afraid to find and unable to stop yourself from finding. Bianca Reyes had a public presence, a boutique event planning business based in Savannah, warm, professional photos, a bio that mentioned she'd recently gotten engaged to the love of my life 11 months ago. A timeline that put their engagement 4 months after mine. There was a photo, 8 months old, of the two of them at what looked like a small engagement dinner, his hand resting on the back of her chair in a posture I recognized immediately, because it was the exact posture he used with me at our own engagement dinner, down to the way his thumb sat against the fabric of her dress. He had not improvised a single thing between us. He had simply run the same tenderness on 2 separate timelines, in 2 separate cities, and trusted that geography would do the rest of the work of keeping them apart. I widened the search the way I'd learned, somewhere along the way, that you widen a search when you've stopped hoping for an innocent explanation and started building a case instead. Property records for the Savannah location listed a residential unit on the top floor, technically part of the hotel, but converted years ago into a private residence. The owner's suite, Julian had always called it. A place he stayed during renovation walkthroughs, a place I had visited exactly twice in 4 years, both times briefly, both times with him steering the conversation quickly back downstairs to the property itself. A change of address filing, 6 months old, listed Bianca Reyes at that same unit. Not visiting. Living there. I found the guest registry next, or as much of it as I could access through a mutual contact at the hospitality marketing firm I still worked for, a favor I called in without explaining exactly why I needed it. Julian's travel calendar for the past 14 months, cross-referenced against both properties' internal booking systems, showed a pattern too consistent to be coincidence once I actually laid it out on paper. 9 days a month in Savannah. 9 days a month largely in Charleston or with me, and the remaining days spread across supplier trips that, when I checked them against Bianca's own public event planning calendar, lined up almost exactly with weddings and vendor meetings she had posted. About tagged, occasionally, with a location pin that put her within a mile of wherever he'd told me he was. I found the life insurance policy update on the 4th day, buried in a joint document folder we'd started together when we got engaged. A folder he'd forgotten I still had automatic sync access to from an old shared drive neither of us had ever bothered to delete. He had updated his beneficiary designation 9 months ago. Not to me. To Bianca Reyes, listed under Fiancé, with a percentage split between her and a trust that, when I traced its formation documents, had been established the same month as her engagement announcement. Structured almost identically to a trust he'd once explained to me, in vague, reassuring terms, as something he was setting up for us, eventually, once we're married. By the end of that first week, I understood the full shape of it in a way that no longer left room for an innocent gap. Julian had been engaged to 2 women simultaneously for the better part of a year, running 2 parallel wedding timelines 18 days apart. In 2 cities separated by 107 miles and a travel schedule flexible enough to cover the distance without either of us ever once comparing notes. Both weddings were being planned as launch events tied to Ashcombe Collection properties. Both of us, I had to assume, believed we were the only bride in the story of a man who had apparently found it easier to build 2 full lives in parallel than to choose, at any point in 4 years, which one he actually wanted. I didn't confront him. I want to explain why, because I think it's the part people find hardest to understand about a woman who finds something like this and doesn't immediately explode. It wasn't fear of him. Julian had never once given me a reason to be physically afraid of anything. It was that I understood, almost instantly, that confronting him that week would hand him exactly what he'd need to manage the situation the way he'd apparently managed every difficult moment in his life, with charm, with a plausible reframe, with just enough plausible deniability to buy himself time to choose which version of the truth to keep and which to quietly dissolve. I had watched him do that in business meetings for 4 years, watched him turn a supplier's legitimate complaint into a conversation about miscommunication so smoothly that the supplier ended up apologizing to him. I was not going to become another supplier he talked his way out of a problem with. On the 6th night, I nearly gave myself away. We were eating dinner, and he mentioned, casually, that he'd need to fly down to Savannah again that weekend. Final walkthrough before the season really picks up, and I heard myself ask, in a voice I worked very hard to keep light, whether the property had a top-floor unit he still used when he stayed over. He said yes, easily, the way you answer a question you've never once considered dangerous, and told me it was mostly storage now, boxes of old fixtures from the renovation he kept meaning to clear out. I nodded and asked him to pass the salt. I have thought about that exchange more than almost any other moment in this entire story. How effortlessly a lie can sit inside an otherwise ordinary sentence about salt. How little strain it costs a person who has had a full year of practice saying it. I called my best friend Raina on the 8th night, the way I imagine most women in my position eventually call someone, needing to say part of it out loud even before I was ready to say all of it. I told her only that I'd found something strange in Julian's paperwork and that I was still figuring out what it meant. She asked, carefully, whether I thought he was cheating, and I remember telling her that cheating felt like too small a word for what I'd actually found, that cheating was something that happened in stolen hours. And what I was looking at felt like something closer to architecture, a second life built with the same patience and permits he used to build hotels. She didn't fully understand what I meant until months later, once I told her the whole thing from the beginning. At the time, she just told me to be careful and to call her the moment I needed to leave that apartment, which turned out to be exactly the kind of promise I needed someone to have made in advance. So instead, over the next 16 days, I did something I don't think Julian ever once considered I was capable of doing, even though he had watched me do a version of it professionally for years, in service of his own hotels. I built a plan. I started by quietly moving my own financial position out of anything joint or shared. We hadn't merged much yet, we weren't married, but I had co-signed a small vendor deposit for the Charleston wedding under both our names, a detail Julian had suggested as practice for being married, and I now understood, with a kind of cold clarity, as a detail that would have left me holding financial exposure if the wedding collapsed publicly and messily. I met with a lawyer, a careful, unhurried woman named Priya Osei, who advised me on exactly how to extract myself from every shared contract without triggering any of the penalty clauses buried in the venue agreements, and how to do it in a way that would look, from the outside, like a scheduling conflict rather than a discovery. I also did something I went back and forth on for several days before deciding it was the only version of this story I could live with afterward. I found a way to reach Bianca Reyes without revealing myself as the other woman in her own story. At least not yet. I hired her, through a colleague's referral and a business email that didn't obviously connect back to me, for a small consulting project unrelated to weddings entirely, brand strategy for her event planning business. Something well within my actual professional expertise. Over 3 video calls, I got to know a woman who was warm, sharp, entirely sincere, and utterly unaware that the man she called her fiancé had, 18 days before her own wedding date. Another woman standing at an altar 100 miles away wearing his grandmother's ring, which I only learned partway through those calls was also, unbelievably, the exact ring on my own hand. He had proposed to both of us with a version of the same family heirloom, a detail that only made sense once I learned, much later, that the family heirloom had actually been recreated twice by the same jeweler at Julian's request, 11 months apart. During those same calls, in the ordinary, unguarded way people talk about their own lives when they think the conversation is only about branding and color palettes, Bianca mentioned things that quietly confirmed the rest of the pattern I'd already built on paper. She mentioned that Julian traveled constantly, but always for good reason, that he'd told her the Charleston property was a joint family project he was overseeing on behalf of his sister, a detail that made my stomach drop. Because his sister had nothing to do with Charleston at all, I had watched him negotiate that acquisition myself, alone, over 8 months. She mentioned, once, almost in passing, that his family was old-fashioned about introducing partners too early, which was the exact phrase he'd used with me, nearly word for word, to explain why I'd never met his parents in 4 years. I remember sitting with my laptop camera off for a full 10 seconds after that call ended, unable to say anything out loud because I finally understood that his excuses weren't improvised in the moment. They were a script, reused, line for line, across two entirely separate audiences. I did not tell Bianca who I was during those calls. I told myself at the time that I was protecting my own plan, and that was true. But I also think some part of me needed to understand, fully, whether she was a willing participant in any of it, whether the two of us were rivals in some knowing arrangement I simply hadn't been informed of, or whether she was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman as thoroughly deceived as I was, just 18 days and 107 miles removed from finding it out herself. By the 12th day, I had my answer, and it was the one that made the rest of my plan feel less like revenge and more like something closer to responsibility. Bianca had no idea I existed. Her wedding, like mine, was fully booked, fully paid, fully believed in. There was one more piece of evidence I almost didn't go looking for, because by that point I already had more than enough to act on, and some part of me was afraid of what else there might be to find. I checked the guest lists for both weddings, out of a curiosity I couldn't quite talk myself out of, and found 4 names that appeared on both cousins, an aunt, a longtime family friend of the Ashcombs. All of them apparently briefed well enough to attend 2 separate weddings for the same groom 18 days apart without a single one of them, as far as I could tell, ever mentioning it to either bride. I sat with that discovery longer than almost anything else I'd found. It meant this wasn't only Julian's secret. It meant an entire small circle of people who had smiled at me across engagement dinners and shower gifts had known, for months, exactly what kind of story they were quietly agreeing to help him tell twice. That discovery changed the shape of my plan slightly. I stopped worrying, after that, about being fair to a family that had already decided, collectively, that fairness wasn't something either bride was owed. I stopped softening the language in the document I was building. I stopped assuming that whatever happened next needed to protect anyone's comfort but my own and, as it turned out, Bianca's. The decisive move I made wasn't loud. I didn't post anything. I didn't call either venue and announce a scandal. What I did was smaller and, I think, more precise. I made sure that the truth would surface for both of us at the same time, on terms neither Julian nor either wedding planner could spin into a story about miscommunication. I compiled everything: the beneficiary change, the property registration, the travel pattern, the duplicated ring, the overlapping engagement dates, into a single, calm, factual document. I sent it, on the same afternoon, to 2 people, to Priya, my own lawyer, formally terminating my involvement in the Charleston wedding and protecting my financial exposure, and to Bianca directly, this time from my real name and my real email. 11 days before her own wedding date, with a short note that said only that I believed she deserved to know the truth before she stood at an altar the way I very nearly had. I didn't wait around to watch what happened next. I had already, by that point, quietly canceled every vendor contract under my name, recovered my deposit through the loophole Priya had found in the venue agreement's cancellation clause, and moved out of the apartment Julian and I shared, into a short-term rental I'd secured a week earlier under my maiden professional email, paid for entirely out of the account he didn't know I still kept separate, a habit I'd never fully abandoned across 4 years of merging almost everything else about my life into his. Julian found out that I knew everything the same day Bianca did, not from me directly, but from the venue in Savannah, which received a call from Bianca's own lawyer within hours of receiving my document, asking pointed questions about a duplicate booking pattern under the Ashcombe name that suddenly looked less like a coincidence and more like a business practice. The Charleston property soft launch event, timed to double as our wedding, was quietly postponed due to unforeseen circumstances 9 days before it was supposed to happen, a postponement that made its way, inevitably, into the small, tightly networked world of boutique hospitality press, where 2 brides sharing a groom 18 days apart is not the kind of story that stays contained for long, however carefully either of us tried to keep our own names out of it. I never spoke to Julian again after the night I moved out. He called 11 times over the following month. He sent one long email that tried, in the exact tone I recognized from every difficult supplier conversation I'd ever watched him win, to reframe the entire thing as a complicated period in his life that he had been planning to resolve before either wedding actually happened, as though intention were the same thing as honesty. As though the trust update and the property registration and the duplicated grandmother's ring were all just administrative delays in a story he'd always meant to tell. Us both eventually. I didn't answer any of it. Some explanations aren't actually for the person receiving them. They're for the person giving them, a way of narrating their own choices back into something survivable. Bianca reached out to me 4 months later, once enough time had passed that neither of us needed anything from the other except, I think, to confirm that the other one was real, and had gone through something close enough to identical that neither of us had to explain the parts that were hardest to say out loud. We've had lunch twice since then. We don't talk about Julian much. We talk about her business, which grew unexpectedly. Once the story became a quiet cautionary footnote in Savannah's wedding industry and vendors started recommending her specifically because she'd handled the fallout with more grace than anyone in her position had any obligation to show. We talk about mine too, which I rebuilt from nothing over the following year, leaving the hospitality marketing firm entirely and starting my own consultancy for boutique brands navigating exactly the kind of reputational crisis I'd once helped Ashcombe Collection avoid, before I understood how much of what I was protecting had never deserved protecting in the first place. Ashcombe Collection sold the Charleston property 18 months later, under circumstances I only know secondhand, through people who still occasionally mention Julian's name the way you mention someone who used to matter more than he currently does. I heard he still runs the Savannah location, though I've never gone back to check for myself. I don't need to. I know exactly what the top floor looks like, and I know exactly how easy it is to convince yourself a room is only ever occupied by one life at a time, right up until a florist spreadsheet accidentally proves otherwise. People ask me sometimes whether I regret not confronting him the moment I read that email, whether I wish I'd called him immediately and demanded an explanation before he had 18 more days to keep managing both timelines as though nothing had changed. I don't. Confronting him that week would have given him exactly the kind of problem he was built to solve: a single angry woman, alone, easy to reframe, easy to outlast until the wedding happened anyway and the truth became something to manage after the fact instead of before it. Silence gave me 16 days to make sure that when the truth finally surfaced, it surfaced for both of us at once, in a form neither charm nor timing could talk its way around. He spent 4 years believing that 2 carefully separated lives were safer than one honest choice. It turns out the only thing separating them the whole time was distance, and distance, it turns out, is the easiest thing in the world for the truth to travel across once someone finally decides to let it. Sometimes, when I'm working late on a client's brand crisis and I recognize, in the tangle of their timeline, some faint echo of my own, I think about the version of me who might have simply forwarded that florist email to Julian with a confused, trusting question mark, the way I nearly did in the first 10 minutes after I read it. That version of me gets a calm, plausible explanation over dinner, a clerical mix-up at the florist, an old client file that never got purged from their system, and believes it. Because believing it would have been so much easier than what I actually did instead. That version of me marries him 18 days after Bianca does, in the same collection of hotels, using some of the same vendors, possibly even some of the same flowers, and never once learns why her husband always seemed to need 1 week a month entirely to himself. I don't resent her, that version of me. I understand exactly why she almost existed. But I'm grateful, in a way I don't know how to fully explain to people who haven't lived some version of this themselves, that a florist spreadsheet error was clumsy enough to catch me before my own trust could finish doing the job Julian had spent 4 years quietly training it to do. I kept exactly one thing from that entire period, tucked in a drawer I don't open often: the printed copy of that first invoice, peonies and ranunculus, a wedding date that wasn't mine, a bride's name that wasn't mine, arriving in my inbox by nothing more than a stranger's careless click of reply all. I keep it not as a wound, but as a kind of proof that sometimes the smallest, most unglamorous accident is the only thing standing between a woman and a life she never actually chose. Raina asked me once, almost a year after everything settled, whether I thought Julian ever truly loved either of us or whether love, for him, had simply become another word for whichever version of the truth kept the fewest people asking questions at any given moment. I told her I'd stopped needing an answer to that question a long time before she asked it. Whatever he felt, real or performed or some version of both, he'd stopped being able to tell apart himself. It had never once been strong enough to make him choose one honest life over two convenient ones. That, in the end, was the only fact that mattered enough to build the rest of my life around, not what he felt, but what he was willing to do, and not do, because of it. I think about Bethesda Manor sometimes, the venue in Savannah I never once visited, decorated for a wedding 18 days before mine with the same peonies and ranunculus a florist accidentally confirmed to the wrong inbox. I think about how close that accident came to never happening at all, one different email address on file, one more careful assistant double-checking a distribution list. One ordinary afternoon where nothing arrived to interrupt the version of my life I'd spent 4 years quietly building toward. I don't spend much time wondering what would have happened if that email had never landed in my inbox. I spend my time, instead, being the kind of woman who reads carefully, checks twice, and no longer assumes that the story she's been told is the only one being written at the same time, under a different name, in a city she's never had any reason to visit.